Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for what we know will be a very timely and compelling discussion. February is Black History Month. It's time to reflect on the many injustices in the Black communities, yet it's also a time to celebrate many amazing achievements. But nonetheless, we have a long way to go. Our members and partners across the region are listening, talking, and working to better understand and finally resolve the challenges resulting from long-standing racism. Board of Trade is exploring various ways to address these issues, one of which is the webinar series that we're launching this morning. This series will include several additional webinars along with facilitated workshops for our members focused on building a more inclusive and equitable regional economy. While equity is both a global and national priority, it is especially critical for our region since it hurts all of us and our economy. For example, there are 53 metropolitan areas in the United States with a population of more than 1 million people. In our region, overall economic growth, we rank only 25th. And a big part of that is racial inequity. For overall racial inclusion in our region, we're at the very bottom, ranking 52 out of 53. So we can and must do better. And we have both an opportunity and a responsibility to fix this. This series will provide leaders in our region with the knowledge and tools they need to run more diverse, inclusive, and equitable organizations and to have a more positive impact on their surrounding communities. Now is the time to rethink how we reach, train, hire, promote workers in our region so that everyone, no matter their circumstances or unique capabilities, has a chance to contribute their best. Change starts here with us. So I want to thank all of you again for participating in this important discussion. I also want to thank our program partners who have made this possible. Cigna, our presenting sponsor and knowledge partner, they have an important perspective on racial disparities in healthcare, which we see now is even more relevant as a result of the pandemic. And we're going to explore that topic in our next webinar. Comcast is our executive sponsor, and they will share some important research on the digital divide later in this series. Again, so much more important now as we've experienced the pandemic. EY is a supporting sponsor, and they're seeking new ways to diversify our talent pipelines. And Grads of Life is our program partner. They bring deep expertise in how to help employers reach their diversity, inclusion, and equity goals. We could not do this without their practical know-how. So thank you all. With that, let me introduce the Grads of Life team who will begin this session with a presentation on the opportunity divide. Ronda Thompson is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer, and Krysta Sadowski is the Director of Advisory Services. I also truly want to thank our amazing panelists for sharing their insights with us today. Ray Van, Becky Shambaugh, and Ken Jenkins. Now, over to you, Ronda and Krysta. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Jack. We are so delighted to be partnering with the Board of Trade on this really critical series, and also just a big thank you to our sponsors, Cigna, Comcast, and EY. We're so grateful for the partnership in this important work. My name is Krysta Sadowski, and I am the Director of Advisory Services here at Grads of Life. And Grads of Life is really an initiative founded within our parent organization, the nonprofit Europe, to further our collective mission of closing the opportunity divide. And we work with employers, really advising on how to build diverse and equitable talent pipeline strategies and to implement inclusive recruiting, engagement, and retention practices that deliver not just social impact, but business impact as well. And I think we've had the experience through these engagements to really see firsthand the critical role that business can play in advancing equity in our country through employment. So needless to say, this is a topic that is just near and dear to our hearts, and we're so grateful to be with you all in this discussion today. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to my wonderful colleague, Ronda Thompson. She is serving as our Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Europe and Grads of Life. She is a wealth of knowledge, bringing over 30 years of experience in this space. And I think kind of fun fact, she's based in the DC area and knows your kind of geographic context very well. So with no further ado, Rhonda.
Thanks, Krysta. Thanks, Jack. And good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. The goal of today's session is to really ground us in a shared understanding of America's legacy regarding systemic racism and how that contributes to the opportunity divide and how it's really impacting our businesses. We'll have some time to hear from our panelists a little bit later in the discussion. And what we really hope to do is just to really dig into some best practices around diversity, equity, and inclusion and how it's impacting the way we serve and the way we operate business today. Throughout the course of our discussion, you'll hear me refer to diversity, equity, and inclusion as DEI. So if you hear that, don't be alarmed. That's what we're talking about. There will be some time for questions from our audience later throughout the discussion. You can use the chat window or the Q&A feature if you have questions. If we have an opportunity, we'll be able to dig into those questions as we're going through, but there'll definitely be some time to check in on questions at the end. All right, with that, let's get started. I think it's really important for us to cover some norms as we're going to this work, realizing that this is a sensitive topic and we're coming into this conversation from different places. Our journeys have all been different. And so we want to ensure that we're assuming good intent, that it's okay to not disagree. We don't want to blame or share oneself on other. We want to practice both hand and thinking. So just both thinking and practice as we come into this work. And then today's session is a starting point. So again, I really want to emphasize that we're all stepping into this journey at different places. And so it's okay if your starting point is a few steps behind where someone else is, or if you're further along in your journey. And we just ask folks to have patience as you're going through this and realizing that we've all come together, hopefully to move the work forward. All right, so let's dive in. America has a really long history of systemic racism, which impacts us all to this day. In order to highlight some of the generational structures of systemic racism, we're going to kick off this portion of our session this morning with a short video. I'm going to ask you to sit for a bit and ask you for a little grace because I recognize that we're diving right into the sensitive topic. And for some people, this may be hard to talk about, but we know that we cannot solve a problem if we don't truly dive in and help and try to understand. So we're going to ask you to boldly step into this session with me today. As you watch the video, I want you to think about a few things and consider. Does it confirm or challenge your thinking in any way? Feel free to jot down anything that resonates with you while you're watching the video, and then we'll have time for questions on the back end. All right, let's start the video.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities. Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents. Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce. Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances. Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have. Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names. Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment, even among college graduates today. You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism. Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases. What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today. As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources. Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
So that video covered a lot of ground really quickly, and I'm really interested to know what resonated for you all. So we're going to start a quick word storm in the chat window. So take a moment. You'll see a link in the chat box. I want you to take a moment and jot down 1 to 3 words that summarize the video that you just saw. The program will generate a word storm in a moment, which captures the words that the group generates. In a moment, our word storm is going to come up on the screen. And again, awesome. So we're starting to see some of the words generate in our word storm. We see truth, bias, privilege, generational fairness, unequal access to capital, unfair, upsetting. So again, there are lots of words, and this definitely brought up a lot of thoughts and feelings for folks. Would love to have a few folks potentially raise your hand, and we'd love to recognize you and to take a few moments just to hear what you'd like to share about the words that you either personally put into the word storm or thoughts that you have as you're seeing our word storm continue to generate. We'll have an opportunity for maybe 3 comments.
Ronda, it looks like kind of speaker capabilities have been turned off for participants, which is just fine, but there's some really good stuff that's showing up here in the chat, and invite people to put in anything else that's coming to mind. I'm seeing other themes around unfair, disappointing, tragic. A great comment here. Rhonda, if you'd like to address.
Thank you. Let's see what we have in the chat window. As you work in diversity and equity arenas, what is your perspective on how we go about educating those who, due to lack of education and cultural sensibility, to then exclude a minority group among all other large minority groups because their particular data population data may not represent a good business case? To study this community as its lower number might not represent potential customer market for economic profitability, therefore not to focus for deserving attention to study or to understand this population's need. We now talk about lack of equity within the equity issue itself. Poor business practices, inequality, need for change addresses unconscious bias. School funding seems to be the root of racism hanging on for generations. My immediate thought was that this video was perfect for my 7 and 8-year-old kids as an intro to systemic racism. So thank you for sharing it with us. Thank you all for those comments, and continue to use the chat window. We apologize that the speaker feature is not working properly, but I think this is a really good start to help us to start thinking about how do we start making some adjustments and start thinking about how do we tackle this issue. We feel the effects of systemic racism in our educational system, our housing, our neighborhoods, and our access to economic opportunity. We also see and feel it in corporate America. This past year, Fortune interviewed Black Americans about their experiences in the workplace. This slide contains just 3 of the quotes from these interviews. As you read these quotes, consider whether these are things your Black colleagues might say about your workforce. We'll just take a minute or so for folks to read and to digest this information. How would these kinds of experiences impact them? How would these experiences impact your workplace? The fact is, systemic racism impacts all of us every day. We all benefit when our workplaces and institutions become more equitable and inclusive. Let's take a moment to look closer at some of the shared costs of systemic racism. The opportunity divide is fueled by systemic racism and the benefits of opportunity talent. One of the most acute ways that we feel the effects of systemic racism in our economy. For example, Fortune noted that unfilled jobs cost American businesses $160 billion a year in lost productivity. The Center for Higher Impact and Philanthropy at Penn notes that every young adult in America disengaged from the workforce costs U.S. taxpayers approximately $14,000 a year in social services. Once these young people become unemployed, these are then able to contribute to tax revenues to their communities. And then finally, Citigroup analysis from 2020 estimates that systemic racism has reduced overall wealth in America by $16 trillion in lost income and wealth creation over the past 20 years. Expanding access and opportunity for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and other groups of people who have historically been denied opportunities to enter the workforce and to grow in their careers over time is good for business, for families, and for our country. Talent is equally distributed among people, but opportunity is not. I'm going to say that again. Talent is equally distributed among people, but opportunity is not. Take a moment to let the implications of that statement sink in. Our challenge today is that it can be difficult for many talented people in America, especially those without a degree and many BIPOC, to advance in their careers and build wealth over time. The organization Opportunity at Work did an analysis of BLS data on the ONET database and estimates that there are approximately 71 million Americans that are skilled through alternative routes. These employees have a high school diploma and have a workplace experience and life experience to transition into middle skills roles. This is exciting news because middle skills jobs, roles that require some post-secondary training, make up approximately half of all jobs in the US, and they are persistently hard for employers to fill. For example, research from Harvard Business School reports that 69% of HR executives note that the inability to attract and retain middle skills talent frequently affects their firm's performance. Yet many of these employees are stuck in low-wage roles with little to no pathways to advancement. We call this disconnect between people with talent, skills, and ambition to do great work and employers need to fill and retain excellent people, the opportunity divide. People impacted by the opportunity divide are often referred to as opportunity talent. This is a broad and diverse group of people in America, and it is important to note three things about this group. There may be overlap between these categories. For example, a person whose first language is not English may also have experienced homelessness. There are broad categories, and there are certainly other subgroups who could be defined as opportunity talent. Black people, Indigenous people, people of color are overrepresented among people defined as opportunity talent. Employers gain many benefits when they hire opportunity talent. The first benefit is obvious. Access to new sources of talent, and they also gain great employees. I want to share a very short video with you all that the Grads of Life team put together called 7-Second Resumes. After uncovering research that notes that the average hiring manager spends only 7 seconds reviewing a traditional resume before making an initial judgment about a candidate. As you watch this video, consider which of the young people you might like to hire or interview.
I worked 12-hour shifts at the recycling company with my dad, who's 72. That taught me a work ethic that I carry with me every day.
When you're running your own business and taking care of your disabled brother, you tend to learn about responsibility pretty quickly.
I was living in a shelter, juggling 3 jobs. I had to be resilient. That's something that you can't teach.
Growing up where I did, a lot of things could have gotten in the way of my goals, but I learned to push through. And that's what I bring to work every day.
My parents weren't fluent in English, so in school, I had to be independent and take initiative. And that's how I handle every project I get.
I see in the chat that someone wasn't able to hear the video. Can someone else chime in just to make sure that that wasn't an isolated issue? Perfect. All right, so would love for you to take a few moments to think about which of those young people would you be interested in interviewing? Donald, who talked about work ethic. Andre, who spoke about responsibility. Yasmin, who talked about resiliency. Johnny, about goal setting. And Jaylene, initiative. Once again, I'll ask you to utilize the chat box to share a little bit more about why you would choose these young adults. It's great to see that so many of you are saying all of them. You thought they were very impressive. They brought something to the table: work ethic, resiliency, initiative. Thank you for sharing, and please continue to utilize the chat window. We found that 7-second resumes are a great way to showcase some of the skills and talents that Opportunity Youth bring to the workforce. As you saw in the 7-second resumes, people broadly defined as opportunity talent bring a wealth of skills, talents, and strengths to the workforce. Here's a short list of these qualities. Resilient, motivated to succeed, loyal to employer, broad life experience, new perspectives, familiarity with diverse populations, represent the diversity of America in clients. McKinsey published a study in 2020 which noted that companies with more gender, racial, and ethnic diversity outperform companies with less diversity in their leadership. The business case is compelling. But there is also an important moral argument for greater diversity, equity, and inclusion that we should not discount. In the final HBR of 2020, authors Robin J. Eli and David Thomas noted that it is time to move beyond the business case for greater diversity. Eli and Thomas write, "Why should anyone need an economic rationale for affirming the agency and dignity of any group of human beings? We should make the necessary investment because doing so honors our own and others' humanity and gives our lives meaning. If companies' profit come at the price of our humanity, they are costing us too much." Our shared legacy of systemic racism has exacerbated the opportunity divide. Consequently, we need to build systems and structures, bridges that help to close the opportunity divide. The opportunity divide is not spanned with one bridge. However, it is spanned by many smaller stepping stones over the cross of the entire talent pipeline identification, as well as through career pathing and growth. Let us give you a brief example of my work with our parent organization, Europe. Europe is a national workforce development program which has helped young adults without college degrees cross the opportunity divide and start careers in high growth industries for over the past 20 years. The young program identifies talent, motivated and young participants ages 18 to 24 who do not have a college degree. These young people then do 6 months of professional training and high demand skills, followed by a 6-month internship in the field of study before seeking a full-time position in their field upon graduation. 90% of our graduates are employed in their chosen field or enrolled in higher education within 4 months of graduating. Their average starting salaries at Year Up is about $42,000 a year. Your partners employed to develop stepping stones to cross the opportunity divide. These stepping stones span much of the talent pipeline, including talent identification, sourcing, in-demand training, workforce experience and mentoring, ongoing professional development, interviewing and hiring, and mentoring and championship. Europe is just an example of what is possible, and it is by no means the only model out there. In order to explore ways that employers can help people cross the opportunity divide, we have a panel of experts with us today that are going to spend the rest of our session speaking with you and talking about their experience and what they've done to help build and develop diverse pipelines and the challenges that need to be overcome in order to accomplish this goal. I'm pleased to introduce you to our 3 panelists this morning, and thank you so much for being with us. We have Ray Van. She's a shareholder at Carlton Fields Law Firm. She is a member of the firm's labor employment law practice, working with clients on EEO and affirmative action compliance. As a result of Carlton Fields' DEI efforts internally, they have been recognized by the Vault Guide as the 4th best law firm for diversity and received a perfect score from the Human Rights Campaign's Corporate Equality Index. Ken Jenkins leads business development for the national insurance firm NFP, the 4th largest private held insurance firm in the US. NFP has been on a very intentional DEI journey since 2016. Ken serves on the DEI Advisory Council for both NFP and the Landon School in Bethesda. Fun fact, he is also a former NFL player. And then last, we have Rebecca Shanbaugh, who is the president and CEO of Shanbaugh Leadership, a leadership development organization specializing in gender equality and inclusion. Rebecca has built her career on the value of practice what you preach, and has intentionally baked DEI practices into the core of her organization. In a moment, I'll pose several questions to the group about the opportunities and the challenges of building more equitable talent pipelines, and cede the floor to our panelists. In the final 10 minutes of our time together, we'll open up the discussion to the audience so that you may ask questions. Again, feel free to use the hand raise feature, or you may also write your questions in the chat box feature, and we'll be sure to get those questions answered as much as possible. All right, so without that, let's get started. So the first question I'll actually ask to each of the panelists: what advice would you give another company about embarking on its DEI journey or seeking to become a great opportunity employer? So Ray, I'm going to start with you.
Well, thank you for that question, Rhonda, and so glad to be part of this really esteemed panel today. I think I will answer the question from the perspective of our law firm. So Carlton Fields, one of the things that sets our firm apart from many other firms is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are among our firm's core values, and has long been a part of its strategic business plan. And when I say long, I mean close to a half a century. For example, the firm, which was founded in Tampa, Florida, 120 years ago, adopted alternative work arrangements back in the 1960s, in part to attract and retain talented women with families to the firm. And to that point, and point of personal privilege, I like to share a fun fact. One of the firm's most distinguished and longest serving attorneys, Sylvia Walbo, was the only woman in her law school class of 1963 at the University of Florida Law School, and she was recruited by Carlton Fields straight out of law school, and she remains with the firm to this day. In terms of specific programs, we've invested at our firm not only in programs and initiatives to attract and retain lawyers of color, but also over the years has supported a number of pipeline programs, consistent with some of the things that you were talking about, Rhonda, to develop future leaders, not only, at the law school level, but also at the elementary, high school, college levels, internship programs, training programs, things like that. But one of our marquee efforts for young female attorneys and attorneys of color is our involvement in the Leadership Council on Legal Diversity, or LCLD, which, as many of you may know, is a national association made up of corporate and law firm leaders whose mission is really to build relationships and networks for and among women attorneys and people of color in the legal profession, and to promote effective programs for member organizations to recruit, hire, advance, support, develop, and sustain diverse talent within their organizations. So each year, our firm nominates a mid-level to senior level associate to participate in one of the flagship programs that LCLD offers for that level. And then we also nominate and include in the program each year a junior partner who is part of the Fellows Program, which focuses on building business development and leadership skills and opportunities. So it's really getting to what it takes to be successful in our business, not so much focused on skills development, because as you said, the talent is there. It's the opportunity piece that we need to enhance. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. Way to get us started, Ray. So Ken, same question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about your company's DEI journey, and then tell us what advice would you give to companies starting to embark on this journey?
Absolutely. And again, thank you very much for putting this together, Krysta and Ronda, for your work with on the front lines for helping some underserved youth get ready for today's workforce. It's very important. And of course, I have to thank the Greater Washington Board of Trade and Jack and everyone for starting this series. But just for some context, I'm a child of the 60s and the civil rights movement. And the energy around diversity and equity and inclusion right now, today, is very reminiscent of those days. It's the feeling and the sense that that there's an opportunity to generate some very specific outcomes for businesses and the community at large. I think my role today and in my experience is more to outline what the basic components of a successful D&I effort is for large companies and small companies. And I'm especially proud of what NFP has done in this space. And most of what I share with you today really comes from my experience sitting on NFP's National D&I Board. Three major themes, and the first one is obviously strong leadership. And as Ray said, this has to come from the top of the organization. But you have to keep these things in mind, and strong leadership and commitment. You have to know in your organization who is responsible in executive leadership to marshal this effort through. What's the structure? How's it look? What does it look like? Where does it actually live in the organization, and where did the tentacles go? That's really important to define early on. And then of course, what resources are available will tell you, how far you can go. The second piece that's really important theme is data-driven analysis, right? We've all had to go do some type of equity audit, and that kind of just tells you where you are now. Some of that information, especially the demographic information, is already readily available to you. And some of you, you may have to figure out how to get the rest. But it will help you identify the strengths and weaknesses, and then help you prioritize your issues of concern. And then third, you have to have input from all the stakeholders throughout the organization. That's why the structure early on, when you set it up, is very, very important. C-suite, board members, middle management, employees, all those are stakeholders in your company that'll make your company stronger if they get on board. And then as a subgroup of all those, subgroups of those groups, there's race, ethnicity, sex, gender identity, parents and family. We all know already how difficult this pandemic has been on working mothers, and working mothers have been hit really hard. There may be a group inside your organization that you want to set up so that those family concerns can be heard. But most importantly, once you've done some of that work at the beginning, and by the way, this is ongoing. These are living, breathing documents. You may, excuse my French, but you may screw the pooch sometimes and have to reassess and decide where you're going to go. But you cannot be afraid to make mistakes along the way. You cannot be afraid to continue pushing forward if it's going to be core to your organization's success. Infrastructure is really, really important. Once your executive leadership has committed to a robust D&I effort, it's not unlike solving other business challenges. At NFP, we created a D&I advisory board that's led by our Chief Human Resources Officer. At Landon, we created a task force on the Board of Trustees. But in my opinion, here's the most critical step. The most critical step in the process is to clearly define the relationship between the task force or advisory board and executive management. Proper governance of this process is going to be the key to your success. You can do this, you can do it with a mission statement, or better yet, a charter that actually describes what the relationship is between that task force, that effort, and executive management, how the information flows between the two, and actually what's the purpose of the organization? What does the organizational chart look like? What's the time commitment necessary to get this done? What are the responsibilities and duties? How does that information flow up and down and decision made? Is this going to be a recommending body, or does this body actually have authority to make decisions? These are the questions that you have to go through. That's before you really get into the hard work.
Thanks, Ken. And Becky, same question to you. Can you share a little bit about what your DEI journey has been and advice that you would have for companies that are starting to embark on this journey?
Thank you, Rhonda. Good morning, everyone, and it's an honor to be a part of this this great panel with so many thought leaders in this space. And Rhonda, thank you for setting I think a really great foundation to jump off for this panel today. You know, I'm sure we'll get into some other questions and things, but if you know Shamball Leadership at all, they are diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we focus now, I founded the first women's leadership coaching and development program in the country back around 1998 or 2000, excuse me, 2002, actually. We started to do our research then, but I've lived on a value and a principle in organization now, Shamball's national and global, based here in DC, that we are better together. And so if that's a value of the company, and you talk about leadership, you know, Ken, it's how do you hold people accountable and ensure that that value is a part of the everyday fabric of the company. And so it's kind of a given with Shamball that our consultants, coaches, faculty, researchers are all very diverse because we believe in the broader range of ideas and cognitive diversity and backgrounds to really help us map back to what the client really needs, you know, so that we can map back to their concerns and to what they view as important and critical success factors for them to thrive and succeed, not only their business, but to create the right kind of culture that really serves what I call better together. And so that's been kind of a given of ours. We've had for probably 2 decades now, very diverse global client base that represents a diversity of talent of African descent, men and women from different countries and cultures. So it's been important, number 2, that our talent maps back to who we serve. So we are very vigilant and have always been making sure that we not only have the right talent that aligns with the company culture, background, diversity of those individuals within the organization, but also we're relentless in terms of seeking out those people in terms of recruitment out into the community, academic institutions, and so forth. So that's been a given of ours. And I think the last thing is around building diversity, equity, and inclusion in not a side program or a conversation, but really permeating into the business strategy, our growth plan, and our talent strategy development plan. So those are some of the key pillars for Shamball. Now, we also have to walk the talk, because what I just shared with you, we go inside organizations and help them to create that blueprint and help them to move from conversation to action. And so I found that there's a lot of chatter and a lot of things on websites that we are an opportunity of equal employment, so on and so forth, but there's not the action. So I think what we try to do is really come back with a story of the organization and how do people really experience work from all walks of life and backgrounds. And then we feed this back up to the executives and leaders, and a lot of times they're not aware of or sensitized to, at the center of the organization, how people really are experiencing work. And then we come up then with the blueprint of addressing key levers and addressing cultural norms and assumptions and building leadership competence and management, employee competence around how to mitigate bias, how to have a low tolerance for stereotyping, and to really build more of that inclusive work environment. And then last but not least, I think one of the unintended faults of an organization when launching these D&I in these strategies is they don't explain the why. And this is very important. So when I was early in my years at General Motors and Fairchild Industries, I was the affirmative action officer. I was then moved into leadership and talent development. But it was always the diversity, you know, my role was always based on metrics and statistics. And that's one measure of success. But I think just and equally as important is not to just have quotas met, but that doesn't necessarily define and sustain success. But it's really about developing and coaching and giving the diverse talent access to opportunities, relationships, mentorship, sponsorship, and being able to see the goodness and greatness in their talents and really align them when we're opportunities where they can thrive. And so that just calls for good management and leadership. And so I think that's the next 2.0 is not just the metrics, but really trying to create a rich feedback culture, really holding your leaders and managers accountable for developing all people so that we all have the same fair opportunities as others. And eventually we'll have that rich, diverse pipeline and have more of that equitable culture. But it does take, sort of what gets done gets measured. And so I think that accountability factor is really, really important. So I'll pause there. I know that's a lot to digest, but just a simple few kind of things we really talk about at Shambaugh and provide roadmaps for our client base.
Thanks so much, Becky. So we have about 15 minutes left, and there are lots of questions that are starting to populate in the chat window, which is great. And so I'm going to ask the panelists if you can try to keep your responses to this next round of questions to no more than 2 minutes, and then we will go to the audience and get some questions there. So my first question is back to you, Ray. The companies that we work in exist in the environment outside of our offices. And in 2020, we definitely experienced quite a bit with the pandemic, with the death of George Floyd and the awakening that we saw from many in our country as in a response to that. So my question for you is, how has George Floyd's murder and the other critical events of last year impacted the environment around DEI work?
Yeah, like so many other organizations at Carlton Fields, obviously the death of George Floyd and all of the social justice and racial justice protests that evolved and developed out of that tragedy was a real watershed moment for us, and of course as a nation. But it really shook us as a firm to our core. But what I think sets us apart from so many others in responding to these events is that we acted in a number of ways, not just by sort of posting messages, on the protests on our social media or anything like that, but our president and CEO, Gary Sasso, actually convened almost immediately a small committee of lawyers to talk about the events, the tragedy, and to come up with an approach to responding in a way that would be both informative and also deeply impactful for those who would see our reaction and, be part of that. He didn't see issuing a statement as the way to accomplish that. So what he did was start with our own employees, firm-wide. He reached out firm-wide and asked every employee in the firm to share with him personally how the George Floyd killing had personally impacted them. And he received so many powerful messages and responses that I think even his eyes were opened in ways that he hadn't imagined. It was cathartic for sure for the firm, but what Gary did, with, of course, permission, was to share those stories, employee stories, as part of a video called Unity in a Time of Crisis that then was shared with law firm clients. It was posted to our social media and so forth in the hopes of, again, helping all those who had viewed it to better understand not only the gravity of the moment, but also to help us all recommit substantively and redouble our efforts towards societal anti-racism and anti-bias. We also, as a result of those events, joined the Law Firm Anti-Racism Alliance, which again is just part of the call of action to law firms in particular to really join in this effort to overcome systemic bias and racism in particular, and to work on action-oriented programs to get us to the next level.
Thank you, Ray. One of the things, Ken, that we saw come out of last year within corporate America is the 110 Coalition and CEOs committing to hiring more Black employees and looking at the advancement of that group, but all BIPOC and people of color as well. And so the question that I have for you is, within the insurance space, we realize it's a predominantly white environment. what are some of the practices that are happening within your space, and particularly some of the workforce development groups that you're partnering with to source, train, and place diverse talent in your industry? And again, try to keep your answer to 2 minutes or less, because we want to ensure that we can get to some of the audience questions.
No, no,
I feel like I'm moderating a debate right now.
I'm happy to do that, but we've done so much, it would take more than 2 minutes. But I'm here to say that, similarly, Doug Hammond issued a statement to the company to reaffirm its commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. The first thing you want to do is make sure that the employees had an opportunity to say how they felt about this. And similarly, they submitted lots of comments to Doug. We do have an executive sponsor in Mike James, who is the person who sits on the executive committee with Doug. And Mike was able to set up some ways that we could also interact with upper management and the DEI board. I can tell you personally that I woke up and I saw George Floyd killing, and then a week later, there was Ahmaud Arbery. And it hit me so deeply that I really didn't know what to do, but I knew how to get my work done. So the first thing I did was all of those things I talked about is setting up the structure inside your organization. We have a Black Resources group. We have a women's resource group. We have a family resource group. First thing I did was call Beth Allen and say, hey, Beth, I'm just really feeling, I don't know how I'm going to work today. And we just talked for, 5 or 10 or 15 minutes. We made sure that it was going to make its way over to Mike James and Mike James, the executive sponsor for DE&I, and then up to Doug. And that all happened within half an hour, right? What came out of that was that not just that event, because this has been a process ongoing at NFP. We know that we are looking for, this is a white male dominated industry without question, but we are looking for board members of color right now to be able to advise executive leadership on where they're going to be able to find qualified people of color to fill these upper management positions and middle management positions, but also associate ourselves with other groups like the Urban League in order to not just show our support as a company, but to also use them for recruiting purpose, point us in the right direction, let us know where we can go find the groups that are underrepresented here at NFP. So I'm really proud of how we handled all that. Thank you. Was that 2 minutes? Ronda, you're muted.
Thank you. I muted and then I went back on. So Becky, this next question's for you. So generally speaking, we see gender initiatives over the past few decades benefit more white women than BIPOC women. From your experience, what should companies be focusing on to ensure that women of color are benefiting from gender equity programs at the same extent as their white peers?
Right. Wow, this is another one. 2 minutes or less. Okay, let me go. Let's look at pipeline development. McKinsey, Credit Suisse, many of the others, catalysts have said within the first 3 years, white and women are actually equally the same in terms of representation. People of color start off at least 3 or 4% less in terms of representation the first 3 years of the pipeline. So we're already lagging behind. And so I think, look, I think we have a lens and we see things as we are versus how other people see them. And so I think we need to go back and really look at our recruitment processes and look at that pipeline from beginning to end and examine where do we go, to Ken's point, where are we hiring people? How are we hiring people? I do believe that there's sometimes unintentional bias in recruitment and then onboarding of people. So I think we need to really, look at our hiring processes early on to get that balance of representation, at the front end of the pipeline, right? And that even gets into internal job descriptions. If you look at most of the job descriptions still, they're biased into some degree, and maybe not intentional, but I think we need to neutralize job postings, job descriptions, so they create an opportunity for all to enter in and have the same opportunity to be a candidate to be considered, right? And so I think the other part of this, in being very engaged with our clients around the globe, is to go out and do listening tours of not only white women, but those of color, African descent, and really truly get to the core of how they, as I mentioned to you, experiencing work and the day-to-day interactions they have or not with others. And to really look at some of those areas in terms of the microaggression. I mean, I could go on and on. The doors are closing. People already are holding bias and stereotype on their qualifications, as we saw in that terrific, I think, educational video, that they're already shut out of an opportunity. So I think we need to really get to the core of how they are experiencing work, and then bring that back and really map that into your D&I strategy to really better close those gaps. But I think most organizations have been looking in the rearview mirror and setting a DE&I strategy that doesn't focus on people of African descent and those of true diversity. It's been mostly white women and men. And so I think that's where we really need to start. But then secondly is to be very prescriptive in terms of pockets of the organization where we have that imbalance of representation. And three or four things we have found with folks of African descent is the lack of visibility and access to opportunities. Number two is the lack of mentorship and sponsorship. The other three is not really getting feedback. And we all get feedback all the time, but it's really getting that constructive feedback. And so people don't want to go there sometimes with giving that constructive feedback. That it's the same for women as well. And I also think that we need to have a low tolerance, helping educate people on their personal stereotype and bias. And sometimes what you do is, I think, is educating people to walk in the shoes of others that aren't like you. And then all of a sudden the light bulbs go off to say, you know what? I didn't know I was sending off those signals. I didn't know my intentions and actions were really limiting and or shutting down those people that aren't like me. And so these are basic fundamental things that we build into, and not only a strategy, but to learning and development experiences and simulations to really bring it to life. And then again, move into actual commitments and measurement of critical success areas that what we can really help move the needle for those of African descent and diversity.
Thank you, Becky. With sessions like this, I feel like we never have enough time, and we're just digging in as the clock is expiring. And so we'll do one final wrap up question, and hopefully to the audience, some of the questions that you had in the chat window were answered in the really in-depth answers that we got from our panelists. And so our wrap up question is for each of you, 30 seconds. What is one thing you would recommend in the DEI space to hold leaders accountable?
I'll take a stab at that. A lot of organizations here in this webinar have a performance development program for their top leaders and managers. And in that top right quadrant, left quadrant, whatever, it is about people and development. As I mentioned to you earlier, what gets measured gets done. And we are consulting with organizations to making sure that that diversity of talent and having that, not only a slate of it, but eventually developing that slate of talent and be intentional in balancing out the representation. And that's going to be one of the success criterion for managers and leaders, and helping them to understand the why. It's less about the numbers, but it's making sure that we have the right talent in the right places with the right ideas and perspective to really sustain our growth and success and align with our customers in the marketplace.
Thank you. Ken, 30 seconds.
Well,
one thing
to help to keep people accountable. First of all, you have to be really honest with yourself about how much you can get done, right? And when you stage your goals in such a way that they are achievable, but understanding that you're not going to be able to do everything all at once.
Thank you,
so you bite off small pieces and get those done, and they build on each other. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ray, one thing.
I would just say, to echo what Rhonda and Ken have said, measurement and accountability is key. But for me, it's good and appropriate, obviously, to have policies that speak to EEO, non-discrimination, diversity, and that sort of thing. But to have real momentum, it's critical to implement action-oriented strategies that include that accountability piece, but also are intentional in driving culture change. If your organizational culture does not support these efforts, then it's really going to hinder your ability to move forward.
Thank you all. So thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to Jack and the Board of Trade for having all of us. And 3 takeaways you'll see on the screen. If there's one of them I'd like to highlight is that talent is equally distributed among people, but opportunity is not. And then would encourage you to take some time to look at the Opportunity Navigator assessment and to visit that site to see if there are ways that your organization can dig deeper into this work. So thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to having you join some of the future discussions that Jack talked about at the top of the hour, and have a happy Black History Month. And we look forward to engaging with you around this very important topic. Have a great rest of the day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rhonda. Thank you very much. Thank you.